thanks a lot for taking the time for this interview. It's very appreciated.
You're welcome.
Thanks. So we're from the CEPI, which translates to the Center of Studies of International Politics from our faculty at the University of Buenos Aires. And we are especially focused on international political economy. So this center is just 1 year old. So we're just starting on the social media and everything. And we're trying to boost it and take advantage of, well, as much as we can from this current situation in order to, to write articles and contact people who are specialized in this. So I thought about writing to you, since you're especially in Italy, who had some budget problems with the European Union in the last 2 years especially. And we were interested in writing an article about that. So if we want to begin. So we were especially focusing on 2 dimensions in terms of time frame. So the present situation and the future about the pandemic. And in the first place, I wanted to ask you about the present situation, the current one, about medical supplies, the spending and the workforce and trade that has been paralyzed. So first of all, do you think that the European Union acted efficiently and fast enough to contain the situation?
Well, of course, I think the short answer, if you give a grade from 0 to 10, I don't know, whatever, I would give 7 to the European Union, so not a bad grade, maybe a little bit more. Well, especially in comparison, and the grade can be understood through a comparison, through 2 comparisons, because you have to think in relative terms everywhere, but especially in this case. First, compared to the last crisis, i.e. the subprime crisis that started in 2008 in the US and then moved to sovereign debt crisis in Europe. The European Union has been much faster than in 2008 and 2009. This is good because I think there's learning by doing happening, and so they understood that Brussels, whatever, that you need to act swiftly, otherwise acting later on might be much more costly. So it's like haggling, discussing too much, negotiating too much, might be conducive to a bigger, to more larger and more longer lasting damage. So that's, I think, a lesson learned. And also in terms of the comparison with countries, so you have the federal or confederation level of the EU, but you have to compare with their actions at the country level. Of course, the budgets are very different because the budgets the national budgets might amount to, I don't know, more than 40%, close to 50% of overall GDP for the typical European country, while in the case of the European Union, we're talking about 1% of the overall GDP of the EU itself. So you cannot you cannot blame the European Union if basically they don't have the money compared to national country level budgets. At the same time, you see that the ECB, but at the same time, regarding the Eurozone, the monetary policy is managed, is decided in a collective fashion by the ECB. And there, I mean, there were a little bit, I mean, I might be biased nationally, so I might have preferred, and I'm not the only one, I might have preferred Mario Draghi as president of the ECB, which acted fastly, for example, in a very efficient way in 2012 with whatever the famous whatever it takes to keep the euro living, to make the euro go ahead. Well, Christine Lagarde, as the new elected president, had some uncertainties, but then I think she behaved well. She did it well. She reversed the mistake. The mistake was a very unwise statement by her during an interview, where she basically said that literally, we are not here to close spreads. The job of the ECB is not to close spreads across the bonds of the various countries, and that was perceived as a declaration of basically lack of capacity, lack of strength, lack or even of competence. But then if people rely on the ECB because it's the actor with such a force, a powerful force vis-a-vis the EU budget, and then you had this declaration according to which it seemed that the ECB did not have much power or was focused on something else, while avoiding in an emergency phase that the spreads are too heterogeneous is a way to keep the euro working and keep monetary transmission working from the decision of the ECB through the banks to the economy. So of course you might have spreads, because spreads are informative. They are prices, and they are, or whatever variations on prices. They should measure the insolvency risk attached to different countries, which might be different. But again, you don't want them to go crazy during a pandemic, like a crisis, in this case, a pandemic. And the crisis is pretty different is very different from previous ones. Why? It's not a matter of a bubble bursting, or it's not a matter of the decrease in demand, because at some point investments, people don't want to invest anymore, don't want to consume anymore. So it's not a demand side crisis that depends on these choices by whatever firms and households. It's about the fact that you want to stop economic activity with a very specific purpose, economic and social activity, so cultural, all activities that involve social interactions, because that's the way to kill the virus, or more precisely, to kill the spreading of the virus. So, and then it starts on the demand side, but it also moves immediately to the supply side. It's both. So it's like, okay, I cannot go to the restaurant, I cannot go to the bar here, what's pane salame on the just on the road in front of my office. I cannot go because they are closed, and so there's no demand, and at the same time there's no supply, because the offices, the bars, the restaurants, the many manufacturing companies are closed exactly with the same purpose of reducing the spread of the virus. So it's a pretty strange situation, to use an euphemism, and well, then you have to pay attention to the fact that fiscal policy should, economic policy in general, so monetary and fiscal policy, should try and deal with the emergency mainly through two different channels. First of all, finance investments in the healthcare sector. Why? Because the mortality for the COVID-19 is not super high. It goes up, it rampantly goes up if you don't have enough ICUs. That's the crucial thing. So you have to contain, because if people go to the ICUs at a lower pace, then you're basically able to deal with them. But because you don't have too many, you don't have to make horrible choices between whom to cure and those who you let die. And but then ICU is an investment that you have to do. And it's an option investment, in the sense that you want to have, maybe at some point, in the case of Italy, we are overshooting, because now we have the number, we increase the number of ICUs by some thousands. I don't remember the exact number, but at the same time, they're free. Why? Because the people in ICU has gone down. But it's important to have this infrastructure to deal with any recrudescence, any kind of similar virus, blah, blah, blah. Okay, first intervention of economic policy should finance this if the countries at the country level or at the EU level. Second, you need to give grants. You have to give subsidies, because there's a lot of heterogeneity across the population, which is a function actually of wealth and income levels. in so-called financial fragility. So there are people, I mean, introspectively, you can see where, I think, how many months of no income can I deal with? 2 years, 3 years, or 1 month? Then you see why you need, the more you have people that in this dire situation, the more you need a transfer, which is not, could be a loan, but maybe it's better to have a grant, just to give these guys income and liquidity. At the same time, so so there's no liquidity because there's no income. While if you have savings, even if there's no income, there's liquidity. That's the issue, microeconomically speaking. At the same time, you have to deal with starting up the economy again, because you can suppose you let the ECB print, the Fed, whatever, print all possible amounts of money. Well, for example, unluckily in South America, you have experience of printing loads of money. But if we're not eating money, we're not consuming money. We are exchanging goods and services. And if production is stuck, is blocked in the medium long run, economic policy cannot do anything.
Okay.
So, at the same time, you have to deal in the short term with. So that's also a way to answer your question about present future. Is the short, as an economy, for an economist, is the difference between short term and long term, medium long term, and economic policy interventions make sense in the short term. Maybe infrastructure investment in healthcare makes sense in both short term and long term. Loans make sense, grants make sense in the short term. But at some point, the economy must start up again. Why? Because we are consuming. GDP is the real value of production of goods and services. We are not consuming money. We are consuming goods and services.
That's very interesting. And I wanted to ask you about the European Social Fund and the Solidarity Fund and the SURE initiative, which are kind of novel, but at the same time, they are assuring that they could use the European Stability Mechanism as well, which was actually created for another purpose and played a huge role in the 2008 and 2011 crisis. So I wanted to ask you if it would be suitable to use the ESM scheme, and what's your view about that, or the tools that the European Union and each nation has to deal with the current economic crisis that this pandemic has led to?
Yeah, so the idea is that, of course, for some countries, especially the countries that have a low level of public debt, can act by themselves. A prominent example here is Germany. And Germany has got an advantage of a very relatively low public debt. Of course, you need to abolish the limits that on national budgets that come from the Stability of Growth Pact, which was the first thing.
Yeah.
You need to have the possibility to run deficits. Why? Because basically the government is spending more than tax revenues, and then it is borrowing, and so it is as if the government is borrowing in lieu of households and companies. It can do it often at better rates, and so then you give, for example, grants to companies and households instead of companies and households borrowing themselves. I mean, they can do that, and sometimes guarantees are given by the government, and well, you might have this thing being done by by EU institutions. So it works in different ways. In general, so regarding Eurobonds, there's a problem. Eurobonds means that they're on the table, but they're not being decided because, but for the so-called recovery fund and recovery recovery instrument, which is the short-term emergency version of the recovery fund, is about 300 billion euros worth, 320 to be exact. And what's the idea? The idea is that Eurobonds is about mutualizing debt, so putting the debts, public debts, all together it's very unlikely that we do in a retrospective way, i.e. regarding existing debts. Why? Because we would be putting together debts of countries that have very different ratings. Some countries have a very high debt, such as Italy, Spain to some extent, Greece, what people call the Club Med, and
Yeah.
other countries have got a lower public debt. So they've different standings. It is not clear why a country with a very low public debt should pool together its debt with other countries that have got a low, much higher public debt. So the only way to make it work retrospectively, as I said, on existing debts, is to make the level of debt similar. So all the provisions in the Stability and Growth Pact should be understood in connection with Eurobonds. Actually, the other way around. You cannot have Eurobonds retrospectively if you don't have the homogenization. You have public finance conditions at the country level becoming similar, becoming more sustainable financially. But it's on the other hand, the recovery, the sure, funds for unemployment, for retraining, which are embedded into the sure instrument, are and spending by the on healthcare, that would be the guarantee. Is an increased guarantee being given by the EU budget, about 25 billion to the BEI, to the European Bank of Investment, in order to increase the funding, and especially the recovery instrument is an anticipation of an increased budget, and it's spent now in the emergency. And the idea is that if there's an increase in the budget of the EU, say about at least 150, I think around more than 100 billion, then it would be financed by the EU budget in the multi-annual framework that goes from 2021 to 2027, okay, with the present commission, the von der Leyen commission. So it's a matter of a political decision to give more tax resources to the center. If this does not, so in a way, this could be the bulk of some Eurobonds in a prospective way done at the EU level, but you need the political willingness, which in this case should come from a unanimous decision by the EU Council plus Parliament, but what matters is the veto power of any member in the EU Council, in order to have a proper larger budget, which is financing more interventions. And of course you need to intervene now, so that's why you anticipate a bit of it with the recovery instrument. Regarding the ESM, the ESM is an insurance mechanism where countries chip in money in the ESM itself. The ESM would also borrow on financial markets. Typically it borrows at very good rates because it's very credible and has got a very high credit standing. And then under conditionality, this is the previous version of the ESM, under conditionality on structural reforms, on improving the productivity of receiving countries that are in distress, typically on banks or on the funding of the budgets, of the national budgets, then you do receive funding at very low rates, below 1% in the case of countries, and with a very long duration. Much better than the IMF. So, for example, ESM has got a bad name in Italy because of, I think, of ignorant propaganda by especially from people of I mean, you can name them. These are guys from Salvini's League and some people coming from the Grillo movement, Five-Star movement. They give a bad name to something that makes a lot of sense in a monetary union, an insurance mechanism in the lack of a federal budget. And but then there's an innovation. Now you have health-related ESM interventions where basically the only conditionality on the instrument itself is about the fact that you do spend for healthcare in a direct, indirect way, which would also include prevention, which is very relevant. And in the case of Italy, for example, you might be receiving something around 36, 37 billions at a very low rate and very long duration. So there are different instruments. And on top of it, and I conclude, you also have the ECB intervening with quantitative easing, increased quantitative easing, purchases of many types of bonds, not only typically government bonds, but not only that. And well, at the moment, it's more than quantitative easing, is some type of quantitative eternity, in the sense that currently the ECB would renovate the loan. I would buy again at the end of the bond, would buy it again. And well, it's a bit heterodox, but I wouldn't, if you don't have big issues of moral hazard in inflation wise, well, it wouldn't be a scandal to basically cancel out those bonds that are in the budget sheet of the ECB. Again, under the premise that it's a one-off thing. Because yes, otherwise, at some point, you are basically financing through monetary expansion the deficits of countries, and at that point, basically money creation, because when you're doing this operation, the ECB is printing money, is creating monetary base. If it's done in a one-off way, typically the effects on inflation wouldn't be big. You must make sure that it's not like a free-for-all kind of equilibrium where everybody says, oh, well, look at the ECB, is basically financing our deficits, let's do deficits galore. That's something you want to avoid. So that's the distinction. Yeah. One-off, but that's, again, this is Kirtland and Prescott. This is commitment, rules versus discretion in monetary policy. This is a result that is as old, dates back to the 70s. So it's pretty well known.
Great. So, well, that actually leads me to the second part, which is the future, what comes. And I wanted to focus on the Italian budget. So they already had problems for approving it in 2019 and 2020 because of the deficit and the debt that you already had. So in case that Italy used this kind of stability mechanism or any other sort, do you think that there will be more pressure in order to cut back on this deficit?
Well, it depends.
Or what do you think will be the future of the Italian budget for 2021?
So, of course, then we're dealing with an emergency, and we would like to see whether the time series behavior of GDP is V-shaped. Like the more it's V-shaped, so it goes down a lot in this first part of the year, and the second part of the year, then it would recover rapidly. All problems related to the fact that you're doing a lot of deficit and increase the debt up to basically by about to something around 150% of GDP are lesser. Why? Because you're back on track. Then the point is that you should focus. This emergency would leave marks. And the more so if the recovery is not V-shaped but is U-shaped, so it takes more time. So regarding the budget, I would make it regarding the budget, the Italian budget. I would point out that there's a difference between the two governments, like 2000. So the 2019 and the 2000 budget, because the problems were with the League Five-Star Movement budget, because they tried to push for additional deficit to finance current expenditure, i.e. the citizenship income and the early retirement provisions of so-called quota 100. I mean, why would you finance those things in deficits? It doesn't make much sense to me. While the budget for 2020, before the pandemic, made more sense, that they really didn't have much problems in approving it and having an approval from the EU Commission. I would now, of course, there are problems that are created, new very serious problems that are created by the pandemic. If anything, current expenditure should be kept on track. So at the same time in the future, like in the medium long term, you have to take into account the fact that some of the expenditure that were not justified before are very likely not to be justified today as well. So if anything, you want to borrow in order to finance infrastructure spending, public investments, and a way to keep on track and improve and start to lower the debt again with some lags. I mean, don't think you want to do it immediately. Is to do a spending review. Okay. In a wise way, because you would be cutting where you can, but you wouldn't be cutting. Actually, you would be spending where it's needed. For example, for an unemployment subsidy, for short-term transfers to companies that have been hurt badly by the lockdown, and so you need wise spending review, which means that you could concentrate the resources where needed. Because it's unclear. I don't think the increased spending by itself out of the crisis, after the crisis, would be able to. First of all, it's got a negative effect on the deficit, and on the debt. Second, I don't think its growth I don't think it would boost growth. So it does make sense. Yeah. I mean, it might make sense politically. It might make sense if you have very strong, the old style kind of not so wise Keynesian ideas. But well, I don't think it's the way to promote growth.
Great. This is another question regarding Italy. Do you see that there will be a differentiated economic effect between the North and the South? We're used to seeing that the South usually struggles a bit more economically speaking, but this time it especially struck the North of Italy. So do you think that there will be this division, or that?
Well, that's another interesting question. Like I don't know. I might agree with you that there's something different here in this north-south cleavage, exactly because of the way the contagion has spread. So we have to avoid, especially for the much lower number of ICUs in the south and the center, that you have additional, that you have the contagion. You would have clusters of contagion that start up in the south and in the center. So that's something to be kept in check. But at the same time, it could be the case that the south might have a easier life, might be at an advantage, not a huge advantage, but some kind of a small advantage, exactly because it has not been hit by the contagion so much. And that's why, for example, some regions in the south, they're pushing for heterogeneous openings of the sectors across regions. At the same time, it is the case that some activities, so the north relies on activities that can in turn use smart voting much more. There are larger companies that are more able to implement the security, the health-related security measures of social distancing, and tourism is more relevant in relative terms in the south and in the north. So these are downside risks for the south vis-a-vis the north.
Great. Okay, so we have another question regarding the European Central Bank, especially. Last year, we saw that there were even negative interest rates. Do you think that the interest and tax rates will be cut down in order to stimulate consumption next year or in the next years in order to reactivate the economy?
I think it would be interesting to in order to answer to this question to look at the difference between what's going on in the US with the Fed and the ECB in Europe, in the Eurozone, well, at some point there were inflationary tensions in the US. So the Fed increased the funds rate, the Fed funds rate, vis-a-vis, away from the floor of the zero floor, the zero lower bounds, the ZLB so-called. While the ECB didn't do that because the inflationary tensions, the growth rate was much lower in Europe, and so it was not time yet to increase interest rates. So I think that we would go for, there might be some negative consequence of zero interest rates on the allocation of capital, because you do not end, you end up, you might be putting money where it's not worth the while in terms of the profitability of the investment. Why? Because the money is so cheap if you get it. Okay, and it is the case that you're gonna go not only for interest rates that are low for a pretty long time, unless some inflation starts. So you would Europe would stay where it is. ECB would stay where it is on the price dimension, i.e. the interest rate dimension. But it would also go ahead with so-called non-standard monetary interventions, i.e. quantitative easing. I don't think there's no reason why they would change course because of this extraordinary time. But at the same time, you have to add fiscal policy in the two directions I mentioned above, before, i.e. the grants to people that have liquidity, people and companies that have liquidity issues, and the spending for some kind of Juncker plan, von der Leyen plan on the infrastructure. And I think, by itself and in a competitive way, for geopolitically speaking, I think it makes a lot of sense to have green investments in Europe. That's fiscal policy. That's structural versus fiscal policy. It's not monetary policy. And we have to recall the fact that in the last interviews and statements as president of the ECB, Mario Draghi himself stressed out several times that you cannot ask the ECB to do what at some point must be done by the fiscal authorities, because they're two different entities. They do different things. So you should not have the ECB replace fiscal policy, which of course speaks to the need. I think I'm a Europeist, I'm pro Europe. I'm pro federal extension. The extension of the federal nature of the EU away from a confederation towards a federation. So I think that the way to do that is to have more resources accruing to the federal level, a true federal budget. It's a political, it's both an economic and a political point of view.
That's great.
All right.
So I have two more questions. The first is about the trade openness that the European Union may have after the pandemic, especially because here in Mercosur, we saw that Argentina took the decision last Friday to move aside from the trade negotiations that we had. So I wanted to see if there's something being talked about in Europe about freezing the negotiations or establishing new terms between the EU and, for example, Mercosur or Asian or the European neighborhood policies, for example.
Well, I think that in emergency terms, the first thing you do is that you stop movements of people. So that's where you saw this happening. Basically the Schengen provisions being stopped because of the emergency to avoid contagion. There might be temptations to go for less free trade, but you are afraid of the normal part of international trade that is actually blocked by the pandemic, i.e. tourism in particular and flights. So I think, and then for example, flights because of social distancing, if we don't get a vaccine, would imply a higher price for tickets. So it's a problem for low price low price companies such as, I don't know, in Europe, Ryanair, EasyJet, etc. I think that people would try there. You might have nationalistic forces that push for more trade restrictions. I think that I don't think this to be an overwhelming force. Why? Because we are nostalgic of many aspects of the free trade part. Which why? Because it resembles the free movement of people part. So in the short run, you might have some issues, but I don't think that in the long run things would change. There are some people that get now kind of people, anti-globalist people that get exalted by this fate. They say, oh, this is the end of global trade. No way. Forget about it. It's you're thinking about the pandemic. So suppose it's 2 years. What's 2 years compared to a generation, which is 25 years? People live three generations. People live more than 80 years. So I think people should not confound the short term with the medium and long term. If they do it, sometimes it's just ideology.
Yeah, that's possible. And to finalize on a similar note, it's more of a political question about an ever closer union in the European Union, which was the original project. We've seen Brexit last year. Finally, we thought it was impossible for it to happen. We've heard about projects of leaving the EU from so many sides, especially the far right side. Even the Cinque Stelle movement has pronounced itself in favor of that in the past. Do you think that this economic and public health crisis will result in a stronger or a more criticized European Union amid this struggling Europe in growing
I think,
criticism?
well, it's a very good question. Like I think it's kind of a mixed bag. Of course, with Brexit, you have an example of a very relevant country exiting the European Union, which is bad from the point of view of the geopolitical strength of the EU. But at the same time, homogeneity within the EU without Great Britain would go up. Great Britain has always been a little bit. I'm sad about it. I mean, I studied I did my master PhD in London at the LSE, so I'm sad about it personally. But homogeneity would go up. Actually, even within the Eurozone. So one problem with the EU is that it's been, for geopolitical reason, been enlarged too much, especially by Prodi. That was, I think, a mistake. I understand the reasons for extending on the East because of the role played by Russia, and still played by Russia. So enlarging too much is not a good idea because then you have too many veto players. So the more we go for a federation, the better it is. And of course, you have nationalistic parties. There are two points to make here. One, I don't think you look so good. You see, for example, the polls for the League are going down. They're now close to 25%, 10 points less than the peak being reached about 34%. If you appear to be exploiting the pandemics for political reasons, you don't look that good.
Yeah, it's true.
First. Second, what's the answer? Are you? It's kind of. I mean, I'm not. I don't have this kind of view, so I think it's kind of clear. It's clear from what I say. It's a bit of a schizophrenic behavior for a nationalistic party or leader if you do two things at the same time. So you complain about the fact that you want to have more national powers of some type, restrict trade, decide things nationally. You don't want to have the constraints, the austerity imposed by EU. But at the same time, you ask help from the EU.
Yeah.
Kind of weird.
Yeah, especially the UK, which was one of the countries
you should
that
read
was more...
today. There was an interview today of Salvini. Let me check where. I tell you. sorry. It was an interview where basically he was praising Macron and Merkel.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, wait, what is it? Sorry, what is it? Let me just check. Sorry, there it is. It's an interview on Stampa by Andrea Malaguti.
Great.
I mean, you can find it on Dagospia, which is I dislike it a lot, but it's on La Stampa.
Stampa.
Yes.
Great. I can practice
my
Italian.
I don't want. I mean, this is Dagospia is what it is. Kind of, it's like the Drudge Report in the U.S. But I can give you the link here. Wait. Where is it? Here. Okay. Chat. Oops. Here you find it's in Italian. Yes.
Great.
It's kind of weird because at some point he was leaving so much room to his economists, Borgen Bagnai, to speak, saying that Conte is a traitor, that it's that we should not have approve mass the ESM at all, because we just need ECB, no Eurobond, no nothing, no recovery instrument, blah blah blah. And then it comes up with this this interview. It's a bit so what I'm saying is that this is consistent with my point I was making about this schizophrenic behavior of a nationalistic politician.
Yes.
That might be saying something very nasty things against the EU and then asking for help.
Yeah.
I don't think it's the best tactical strategic maneuver to get help from somebody. It's kind of passive aggressive. Doesn't look very good psychologically.
Yeah, I think that's a very Italian phenomenon. Not the schizophrenic part, but the far right in Italy, the Lega Nord and Cinque Stelle.
Yes.
And their Euroscepticism is not that much Euroscepticism, but using that argument in their favor when
it's unclear. You also have to take into account the fact that there's a little bit of wait, so just one sec. There's one issue to take into account regarding the workings of the league. It's true there's a little bit of a dictatorship in the sense that it's monocratic. The leader, i.e. Salvini, and before Bossi, especially Maroni, but the main issue was you can say that Bossi and Salvini are kind of quasi-like dictators within the league. But you do have the people that are start to be very skeptical about this within the league about this line, because it doesn't pay out electorally speaking, and it would push for a very dramatic, revolutionary, I don't know, Eurexit, Europe exit kind of outcome, and who's going to join? I don't know if Fratelli d'Italia might be joining, and for sure Berlusconi now is declared explicitly. I mean, he belongs to the European Popular Party, to the PP, European EPP in English. He declared that we should go for the ESM healthcare funding directly. It was a great political move. I mean, it was pretty funny because people were like expecting to see what Berlusconi would do, and he just immediately said in a very not with metaphors or
it was very straightforward.
In a very straight way, no obscure and ambiguous metaphors. He said, "Oh, I think we should go for ESM." That's it.
Okay.
And maybe go for. He would like a government where everybody's in. Maybe there's Draghi or somebody else. Maybe Enrico Letta. I don't know. No league. and everybody in phase two instead of Conte. Even if Conte is high in the polls, he would do that, and then basically politically, the nationalistic party, i.e. the League, mainly the League, Fratelli Italia is a bit different because, for example, he's very happy to have good links with the US administration rather than Russia. Well, all in and League out.
Yeah.
Actually, League out and some members, the sovranisti from the Five-Star Movement out. So a split in the Five-Star Movement.
When are the next elections?
2022.
22. So they are
you have to check.
kind of close-ish. So they're starting to play their political game. If they don't have elections before that, of course.
Let me see. So 2018, you have to 5 years, 2023. Yes, 5 years, 2023.
Great.
Yeah, I think I have to go.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks a lot for the time. That was all the questions that we had. Cool. Once we have the article and the interview translated to Spanish, we will send it to you.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, and we'll keep in touch.
Good. Thanks. Have a good time. Thank you. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.
Ciao.
Bye.
Bye-bye.